All right, students. Well, this week we are going to finish talking about Andrew Jackson, but I wanted to just quickly recap what we talked about last week, and then we'll talk about the last aspect of President Andrew Jackson's kind of legacy, which is his treatment of Native Americans. So, remember last week we talked a little bit about, before Jackson became president, him invading Florida without orders from James Monroe, and that allowed the United States to acquire Florida from the Spanish, even though he wasn't technically supposed to be doing it. We also talked about the concept of Jacksonian democracy, which is this kind of idea that more people had a say in how presidents and other elected officials were chosen. It went from having just white male landowners who could vote to now all of a sudden it was any white male. You did not have to own land anymore, which kind of eliminated you having to be rich in order to vote in elections. And we talked about the elections of 1824 and 1828, where in 1824 John Quincy Adams won, even though technically Andrew Jackson got more votes, and that made Andrew Jackson very upset. 4 years later, Andrew Jackson defeated John Quincy Adams, and he became president for the next 8 years. And when Jackson became president, he was kind of a down-to-earth, good old boy. He believed that the White House was for the people, and on the day he got inaugurated, there was a big party, and we looked at this quote from Margaret Baird Smith about how the block party on the White House lawn was just crazy on Jackson's election day. We also talked about the spoils system and a kitchen cabinet, two things that came out of Jackson's presidency that you can argue whether they were presidential characteristics of Andrew Jackson or whether they were rough, not-so-presidential qualities. We mentioned the three different economies that were emerging during the time of Andrew Jackson. You had the North, based on manufacturing and making things. You had the South, based on agriculture and farming, and they used slaves to do that. And then the West was all about land, buying and selling land and developing land. And finally, last week we talked about the nullification crisis and how South Carolina was the drama queen of the states, and they did not want to cooperate with paying a tariff on imported goods, and they were threatening to secede from the Union. Andrew Jackson sent his vice president, John C. Calhoun, to break it up, and John C. Calhoun decided that he sided with the South Carolinians, and that led to Andrew Jackson threatening to decapitate his own vice president. And a result of all of these things, including Jackson not renewing the National Bank in 1836, the result of all those things was that the Whig Party was formed to go against Andrew Jackson. So this week we're going to talk about Native Americans and Andrew Jackson. And the story, like so many times, starts with something of value being found and people wanting that thing of value. So in 1828, gold was found in Georgia on Cherokee tribal lands. And that gold was found by a little Cherokee boy. He took it into town to see if any of the white men would trade with him. And sure enough, they asked him, they said they would trade with him for it, but they wanted to know where the little boy found the gold nugget. So he showed them, and of course it was on Cherokee tribal land, and that led to people wanting to, the Americans living in Georgia wanted to take that land from the Cherokee tribe. 2 years later, the whole southeast part of the United States, 5 different Native American tribes that were in the southeastern part of the United States were asked forcibly to leave their lands and move west in order to make room for more Americans to settle and to harvest the gold that was in Georgia. Those 5 tribes were the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw. They were forced to move about 800 miles from their homes to what is modern-day Oklahoma. The Seminole tribe, they fought in kind of guerrilla warfare style. They hid in swamps and fought with the American army and refused to be taken lightly. And in fact, some of those Seminole were never forced to move because they were hiding out in the swamps, and there are a number of Seminole Indian descendants living in Central Florida today that are the descendants of those that refused to leave during this Indian removal. The Cherokee I'll talk about in a second, but the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Creek just kind of didn't really do a whole lot of fighting back. They just kind of resigned that they were going to be moved, and they went. The Cherokee tried a different approach, though. The Cherokee sued the United States government, basically saying that it was their constitutional right to live on their tribal lands that they had acquired from treaties with the United States, And the case went all the way up to the American Supreme Court. And when it got to the Supreme Court, something surprising happened. The Supreme Court agreed with the Cherokee tribe, and they said the Cherokee deserve to keep their land. You see, the Cherokee had actually tried to assimilate with the Americans. The Cherokee tribe had started to dress like the white people. Many of the Cherokee had converted to Christianity. They formed their own tribal government based off of the United States Constitution. And so the Cherokee were trying to assimilate into the United States, and because of this assimilation, they were actually knowledgeable and knew what their constitutional rights were. And so they sued. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided with the Cherokee and said, Andrew Jackson, United States government, you have no right to take their land. Well, something weird happened next. Andrew Jackson, when he heard about the Supreme Court ruling, instead of obeying the Supreme Court ruling, which is what he should have done as president, because remember, the Supreme Court can declare laws unconstitutional. Instead of obeying that and dropping the subject, Andrew Jackson said of this, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he basically said, he has made his ruling, now let him go and enforce his ruling. Basically, Andrew Jackson was saying, as president, as head of the executive branch, whose job it is to enforce laws, Andrew Jackson said he would not enforce this law and turned his back on the Cherokee people. And at that moment, Andrew Jackson probably did something that he could have been impeached for if there would have been enough votes in Congress, because he violated the Constitution and his duty to follow the Supreme Court in their ruling. Well, several years later, after Andrew Jackson is now out of the presidency, the Indian Removal Act is carried out, and American soldiers are sent to Georgia and Florida and Alabama and Mississippi, and they force these 5 tribes to leave their homes. Many of these 5 tribes, like I said, some of the Seminole hid out in the swamps and weren't forced, but they forced these 5 tribes to move west 800 miles to what is modern-day Oklahoma. The Cherokee tribe alone, there were 16,000 of them that were forced to make this 800-mile journey in the middle of winter. Many of them had to walk the entire 800 miles. Many of them were cold, many of them were hungry, and 1 out of every 4 of the Cherokee died along the way of starvation, of hypothermia, and even of exposure to the elements. And this horrible, horrible journey became known as the Trail of Tears. And when we talk about the biggest mistakes, the biggest sins of the United States of America, 2 things come to mind immediately. One is slavery and the treatment of African Americans, and the second is how we've treated Native Americans for our entire existence over the last 500 years. And the Trail of Tears is maybe one of the worst examples of how the United States government as a country treated Native American people that were here a long time before any of the European settlers showed up. So, this week's assignments are going to, 2 of this week's assignments are going to revolve around the Trail of Tears, and you're going to kind of get to see a primary source account from someone who was there, a soldier who writes to his grandkids several years later and basically says, I can't believe I was part of this. And then you're going to have another assignment that'll have to do with the Trail of Tears as well. So, that's it for this week's video. If you have any questions or you need some help, email me or Schoology message me.